Hello, I'm Wendy Framst, and this is Watercolors with Confidence, Trees and Forests, Lesson 1. Let's paint some trees. I'm a watercolor artist from British Columbia, Canada. Surrounded here as we are by beautiful, untamed wilderness, many of my students want to learn how to paint trees. So in response, I've developed a few lessons on how to paint this rewarding subject matter. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of the art terms value, shape, and form. And I'm going to demonstrate how critical they are in adding depth, interest, and realism to our subject matter. For many of you, this will be a review, but as I go over the information, I encourage you to be thinking about how you can enhance your paintings by really reinforcing these concepts. One challenge most artists, including landscape artists, face is how to make objects in a painting on a two-dimensional surface appear three-dimensional. One critical tool to make this happen is value. What value refers to is how light or how dark something is. Here I have a grayscale value chart. In this example, black is the first value, while white is the 10th value. As you can see, there are gradual changes in between each step. Some artists have such amazing control that they can create 20 distinct values or even more. But for the purposes of our discussion, we're just going to focus on 3 values: dark, medium, and light. Now, before we get those brushes out, another art term I want to emphasize is form. Form relates to the thickness or the volume of an object. One way we can begin to understand the form of a complex object, such as a tree, is to reduce it down to its basic forms, such as spheres and cylinders, like the ones I have here. When we study how light falls on them, you can see subtle changes between the light and dark values across the surfaces of these examples. It's these gradual shifts in light and dark that are the key to creating the illusion of form. Let's paint a sphere together. Circles can be a bit tricky to draw, so you can use any circular object. I'm going to begin by using a green watercolor pencil crayon and just trace around my circular object. I'm just going to darken that so you can see it. Now, we're going to imagine that the light source is coming from the top right-hand side. And so what we need to do is save an oval area quite near the top right-hand side, not exactly on the edge, but near the edge. And I've drawn that lightly in my pencil crayon. And now what we're going to do is take a wash of green paint, which I've already pre-mixed here, and we'll just fill in the area around the circle. And what this oval area is going to represent is a highlight. That would be where the most light is falling on our object. Now, while the paint is still a little damp, what I'm going to do is take a thicker version of the same color, just mixing it up a little here, and I'm going to put it along the bottom left-hand side of my sphere. So the left-hand side and the bottom, that's where the shadow area is. The top right-hand side is where the highlight area is. So you can see, using just one color and 3 different values, basically 3 values, we've given the viewer enough information to see that our form is rounded and to see which direction the light is coming from. Let's apply the same process to creating a cylinder. This time I'm going to use a brown pencil crayon to draw my cylinder. So I've got an oval here for the top, and then 2 lines down the side, and semicircle for the bottom. Again, our light source is going to come in from the top right-hand side. So in this case, our highlighted area would appear more at the top and on the right-hand side. And it's going to kind of taper as it gets farther and farther away from the light. So it's closest to the light at the top. It'll be thicker and brighter there. And it's going to gradually get thinner and thinner as it comes down. So now I've got a little bit of burnt sienna mixed up. And we'll just apply this to the cylinder, except for where our highlighted area is. Now the top is also near the light, so I'm just going to make it ever so slightly bit lighter. You can decide what color you would like that to be, and what value you would like that to be. Now I'm coming back in for a little bit more burnt sienna, and I want it to be a little darker. Even if it was the same value and I overlaid it, because of the transparent nature of watercolors, it would appear darker. But I really want to emphasize the idea of the form turning. So I'm going to put it on a little thicker. And this time what I'm going to do is apply it to the left-hand side and to the bottom of our sphere. So there you go, that's all it takes. So just as with the sphere, all we did was we concentrated on 3 main values: the light for the highlight, the local color or the mid-tone color for the base of the object, and then some additional color and value, a darker value for the shadow area underneath. And once again, this form is beginning to look rounded, and it also, we can tell where the light source is coming from. Now if we want to make this even more realistic, what you do is you just have a gradual change between those value shifts. Can you see how the sphere might represent the leafy areas of a deciduous tree, and the cylinders could represent the trunk and the branches? But if we just stop here, we're going to end up with childlike lollipop trees. So what we're going to do next is imagine a tree as a series of small sphere-like shapes, with the top right sections being light and the bottom left sections being dark. So again, we'll use my watercolor pencil crayon just to get us started with this. I'm not going to make all the spheres the same size, because I really like to see variety in my paintings. So now what we do is, for each of these clumps, we think of them like our sphere. So we're going to leave a highlighted area and cover in the rest. Leave a highlighted area and cover in the rest, and so on throughout the whole tree. Now this is very cartoonish and quite exaggerated, but I really want to reinforce the idea that within the tree there are clumps of leaves that can each be treated in this way, so that we get a turning of the clumps of the branches. Now, what our circles are going to need is some additional shading. Keep in mind that there's an overall form which is somewhat like a sphere in itself, and the top of the tree is going to appear lighter than the bottom of the tree. But then within each of the clumps, there's going to be some shading. So we'll just reinforce that idea with really dark shadows on these bottom clumps. And we'll come in with some lighter shadows as we move up the tree. This one got a little bit dark. So again, this is quite a cartoon version, but that's how I want you to be thinking about the trees as you're building them. Also, now we can put in the trunk. And remember our cylinder? So the trunk is going to be a tapered cylinder. It's going to be thicker at the bottom, and as it comes out, it might turn into a Y shape. And the Y shape where the branches are thicker at the base as well. And most trees aren't really straight. They have some natural curves and hiccups and little bumps, gnarls, and roots. Okay, you get the idea, but what I really want you to remember is that they're thicker near the base, they get thinner as they travel up, and we don't want them really straight. They're branching out and going in different directions, but they are a lot like a cylinder. In order to make them look like a cylinder, we're going to have to add some additional shading. And to do that, I'm going to come back in with the darker version of the brown. Now, my light source is coming from the top. That's why we have our highlights up on this side. And so my shading goes on the left side and near the bottom. Another little trick to remember is often the branches will be in shadow because the trees, the leaves are hanging over top of them. So the tops may also, the very tips, right where they're below the leaves, may also be in shadow. As I mentioned with our tree, at the base, the leaves are darker, and as it comes up, they're a bit lighter. We've got a little bit of a dark color here, so I'm just going to lift out a little color to make that value a bit lighter. And now the base is a bit darker, as it should be. Okay, now that you understand how value can help to create form, let's use dark medium and light paint to paint slightly more realistic trees. I'm going to begin by just giving myself a little bit of a tree shape to follow. You can sketch this in with pencil. I'm using a watercolor pencil crayon because I want it to dissolve once I start painting. Remember, your shape should be nice and organic. We don't really want lollipop trees. And now what I'm going to do is begin by scattering some water randomly all around that tree shape that I just created. But on purpose, I'm going to leave gaps where there's no water. Because when the paint touches the water, it will blossom and bloom into those spaces. And where there is no water, it'll leave holes. And trees look much more realistic when you give them sky holes throughout. I like to think of it as the places where the birds will fly through. Now that I've got some water spread through, I'm going to come in with my paint mixture and I'll just tap it near where I see the clumps of water. And sometimes I want my paint to touch beside where the water is, and sometimes I want the paint to touch over top of where the water is. And what this does is it automatically helps me to have some additional value changes. Where there's no water, the paint is going to be a little bit darker, and where there is water, as I said, it will spread out, but also it will lighten it because it's thinning the ratio of paint to water. I'm just sort of poking in. I'd like to think of this as sort of dots and dashes, and I'm putting in my tree. You don't want them too even. You can have some areas that are a little more filled in. I'm just being conscious that I don't want to cover everything on my page. Alright, so I'm just taking a look at my shape. I've got a little clump here, sort of a larger grouping there, and a medium one here. Just maybe a couple more to balance that out. And I don't like how regular everything is, so I'm going to stick out a few branches here and there, as though there's a clump of leaves across the branch. Now, I want that to dry just a little bit, so what I'm going to do is create another tree in beside here, and this time what I'm going to do is make this tree more like a tree you might find in Africa, where it's very thin and wide as opposed to more of a rounded shape. Okay, and I'm just giving myself ever so slight outline to follow. Quite often I don't even use an outline. And then I'm going to put some water randomly through, and again I'm making a real conscious effort to leave some holes. And sometimes I want the green to be beside the water and to flow into the water, and sometimes I want the green to stand on its own, so that we are already starting to get some interesting shapes and sky pockets. As I'm going through, I'm looking at the little spaces and I'm thinking of lace. I really like to have a lacy pattern within my branches. So the holes are just as important to the shape of the tree as the green leaves are. Okay, great. Now this one is drying up nicely. We'll come back to it in a second, but in the meantime, I want to create one more tree shape, and I'm using the lighter paint, and I want to make this one really quite tall and thin, shaped almost like a cone, and I'm using the point, the side of the brush, it's sort of like a point. So I'm getting these dagger shapes. Now, if I continue on this way, it's going to look very cartoonish. So once again, I need to remember to leave myself some little holes within the tree, but also break up and create some more randomness in the patterns on the side. I think that'll get us started nicely. Now we can come back in and start to develop the values on our tree. And just the same as when I was applying the paint where there was water, there's still a few wet patches. So sometimes I want my paint at the base connecting in, and sometimes I want the paint on the outside of the clump just to break up the shape and again give me really a darker value so it's not diluted with the paint, with the water. I'm just working my way up the side of the tree. Now I'm remembering that I want the top to appear lighter than the base. So at this point you could stop already, but what I'm doing is just coming in with a slightly lighter version than I've used down here. So it'll be darker because we're doing a second layer and it's appearing at the bottom of the clumps, but it's lighter than these areas. In fact, let's give them one more pass with some really thick paint just to make sure you can absolutely see those differences. And the idea that we want this side and the bottom to be darker than this side and the top. Now what I want to do is come back in to this wide short tree, and I'm building up the values in the, again, the left hand side and more towards the bottom. And as I'm coming to the right and the top, I'm putting less. This one has dried a bit more, so I'm getting a dry brushing effect. It's not blossoming in. It's a balancing act to know when your paint is very wet, if you put down a spot, it might travel very far and very fast. And as it dries, it doesn't travel quite as far. When your paint is thick, it doesn't travel quite as quickly either. There. Now we'll move back to our third tree. Now this one is already dry. So what I'm going to do is just wet the areas that were already painted, because when I have wetness on my subject and I touch the paint, it travels a little farther. A dry brush effect, there's no blending or bleeding at all. And I really like the look of the leaves when they mingle in with the other colors there. As these trees dried, what I found was that there's not as much of a value change as I was hoping for. So we're going to come in one more time, and this time they're dry, and we're going to dry brush in some pure paint with no water in it. And what will happen is that will be a much more concentrated solution and give that rounded form that I was looking for. I don't need a lot of it because we've already got some blending happening. So I'm just hitting little spots here and there. And I'm staying away from the top of the tree because we're just really looking for that turning of the form, especially on these bottom clumps. Now that's looking pretty methodical and symmetrical. So what I want to do is just break up those shapes a little bit with some water, and that will help them to blossom out a little more. We'll do the same with this tree. And let's give it the same water treatment as well. And finally, our tall and thin tree. Trying to vary my brush strokes. And we can break up those shapes a little as well. Now, I'm just going to dry that up again. If I put my trunks on at this point, what's going to happen is everything is going to blend together. And I would like to keep the browns and the tree separated for this example. So we'll dry it up first and then we'll come back in and put in the trunks and the branches. All right, our leafy trees are all dried out. The leafy portion of our trees are all dried out. So now I'm going to turn my attention to the trunks and some branches. I've mixed up some burnt sienna here, and I encourage you to start with the largest brush that you can fit into a space. I love to paint detail, and so I often will turn to really small brushes, but save those for the end. Now, knowing that my light source is coming from the top right-hand side, I usually like to start my tree trunks on the left and kind of near the bottom, because I know those are going to be the darkest areas. And what I'm doing is traveling up the trunk. It's wider at the base and it gets thinner as it travels up the tree. So each of the branches are the same way. They tend to be wider at the base and they get thinner, they taper as they come up the tree. I'm going to switch to my smaller brush now. When I'm painting tree branches, I think of Y shapes, and sometimes I like to cross my branches. Let me show you an example of that. I have a branch coming out, and there's another branch on top of it that comes out and it tucks around, and you're not sure where, but somewhere those two cross one another. And we'll bring just a few little branches up into the leaves, the leafy area. But remember, those get much thinner, and I actually usually paint them a bit lighter as well as they're coming up the tree. So we'll have some poking out here. and some right through. I like to put them in the white spaces, but they also may appear in front of some of your leafy areas. Okay, that's going to get us started for that tree. We'll move on and do the same for our wide tree. And let's give him a pretty wide base, but we'll make him sort of short and wide. So chances are you will see some roots, and we want it wider at the base and thinning as it travels up. Now this one has to have an extensive branch system to reach all the way out to the edges to hold all those leaves up. And every now and then when my branch is too even, what I do is I just paint into it and I make a little bit of a thick bump. It's like an old gnarl. Now, once again, that's enough to get us started. So I'll just move quickly over to our third tree. What I've found when I see these trees is I don't usually see much in the way of branches in them. So I'm not going to put a lot of branches peeking through. It's usually very dense. So now I'm coming back in and I'm getting thicker paint, and I'm going to reinforce the bottom and the left hand side of these branches, and also where it's hidden underneath the leaves there might be a little shadow there as well, so we can just tuck that in. Sometimes I paint on top of the brown that's already there, and sometimes I make a new line beside the brown, especially if I want to widen the branch, then I'll paint it beside. And if I really want it darker, I may paint it over top. Then the branches as well, they probably have a little bit of shading underneath. And if you find you get too much on, then I would just take a paper towel and dab it off. Coming now to our short little wide tree. Same process, we are really concentrating on the left hand side and the bottom. I like how the water picked that up and it just bled it out, because all of these things that I'm showing you is the theory of the trees, but you're going to want to observe the trees that are around you to see how they look, and there may be spots on the trees or knot holes that make the things that I'm telling you not quite apply to your specific trees. So having some theory makes it easier for you to look at the trees and see and understand what you're looking at, but it's actually the observation I find that helps me to make things appear more realistic when I am copying nature itself. I just put a little bit of darkness at the base of these trees, and my leaves had already, my branches had already dried, so I'm just softening that transition. It was a little bit too strong there. Thank you so much for watching. I encourage you to come back next time where we're going to mix a variety of greens, and we're going to do it right on the page. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, press the like button below. And also, to be notified of new videos, press the subscribe and the bell icons. Ready for more watercolor fun? My original course, Watercolors with Confidence, provides over 10 hours of foundational information about watercolor techniques, materials, and theories. All of these concepts are reinforced with several fun hands-on activities and projects and areas for feedback opportunities. The original Watercolors with Confidence is available through Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find the links below in the description. Remember, check out the other lessons in the Watercolors with Confidence Trees and Forests series. I look forward to painting along with you next time. Bye for now.